full, pretty full agenda. So let me share my.
Okay, sorry about
Oh,
that.
great, no problem. Um, okay, everybody. Hello. So we've reached our final week, finally. And unlike the previous weeks that we've been talking about, all of us have lived through at least some of the events that we're going to be discussing today. And I subtitled this War, Pageantry, and Protest because those are three big areas that we're kind of going to be looking at today. And they're areas that really have dominated London in the past century or so. Now, this time period starts with around the death of one of the only handful of female monarchs in Britain's history, Queen Victoria. And she was the only sovereign that most people knew by the time she died. She was on the throne a very, very long time. And we kind of ended, if you will, with Charles III's succession. And of course, he succeeded his mother, Elizabeth II, who was the longest reigning monarch in British history, 70 years. And again, another just one of a handful of female monarchs, and another one that most people could not remember a time before Elizabeth II. So I thought that was kind of interesting that we're sort of bookending this lecture on both of those women. Now, what we're going to be looking at today are some very significant events, including two world wars. This was a time of a lot of protests going on in the country. Later, we see terrorist incidences that took place, lots of royal pageantry and celebration. There was also a deadly flu epidemic, which we're not going to talk about today, and a lot of political upheaval, which we're not going to talk about today because again, I only have so much time, and so we're kind of doing a condensed history here. But we're also going to look at the continuing evolution of London's skyline, because every time I return, and I return fairly frequently, that skyline continues to change. And in fact, as I was trying to update this lecture to bring it up to 2024, I realized there's just no way I can squeeze in all of these new buildings and talk about all of these new buildings. So I'm going to talk about some of the buildings, particularly the ones that cropped up in the early 2000s, but not getting into the real new ones at this point because they're just too numerous and too continuous. But anyway, with that said, if you haven't already done so, please mute your microphones. So again, today, lots of key events, and then we're going to look at some architecture at the end. I always like to close with the architecture. Okay, so I wanted to start talking about, again, this population growth. This is a map from Encyclopedia Britannica from London in 1900, and you can see how much London has spread out over the centuries. And by 1910, there were over 7 million people living in Greater London. That was an area that covered about 200 square miles. I know Peter had a question about that last week, about how big a geographic area are we talking about. By 1910, it was about 200 square miles. So the metropolitan area spread out into the suburbs. You had Surrey and Kent to the south, and Middlesex and Essex to the north, basically. So it's quite a large area at this point. And population wise, this was kind of interesting. So, we've been talking about the population booming and booming and booming. And the beginning of the 20th century, we did see this population growth, as we have seen in other centuries. But most of the 20th century, we saw London actually having a shrinking population, losing population. And this began in 1939 at the start of World War II. And London would not come back to reach its pre-war peak of it had about 61 million, I believe, at the start of World War II. It didn't get back up to that level again from 1939 until about 2015. And there were lots of reasons for this. Many people left during and after the Second World War. They left the city. You saw large-scale developments in the suburbs. We talked last week about the trains coming in and better transportation options. So we had more people moving out into Greater London or beyond into the suburbs to live instead of living in the city. As we go on through the 20th century, the cost of living got higher and higher. There were loss of job opportunities. Not as many job opportunities were around as there had been before. We also saw, many, a lower international migration, right? Because of Brexit in part, and because of the pandemic. That also saw a loss of jobs, a loss of migration coming in. With the pandemic, we also saw people who were now being able to work from home. A lot of companies were now posting job offerings that were remote work options. So people didn't have to move into London to live work for a company. They could live wherever they wanted to and work for a London-based company. So that saw a lot of drop of population as well. Now, net EU migration to the UK as a whole has also fallen, like I said, because of Brexit. So we saw those numbers fall. But despite that, and despite predictions to the contrary, the population of London has started a very slow and steady increase of about 1.2 to 1.4% per year over the last few years. So we are beginning to see that population grow again slowly. Now, talking a little bit about the early period, a significant part of London's population growth from the 1880s, before our period today, onward, has really been made up of migration. London has drawn on young people of working age, to come in. That's never gone away. People come into the city to try to make money. But it started attracting increasing numbers from Europe as well. So we saw people fleeing from stagnant economies, from political and religious strife. And the largest of these minorities were made up of Russians and Poles, mainly Jews who settled in the East End of London, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And by 1911, we saw about 68,000 Jews coming in, and that wasn't counted those who were already born in Britain, but about 68,000 who had come in. And then the next largest migrant group coming in by far, the largest by far, was German-born with about 35,000, and then Austro-Hungarians who came in at about 10,000 around 1911. Now, since this time, if we jump up to the present, more or less the present day, or more recently, the UK has experienced unprecedented levels of immigration, particularly since the pandemic. And the latest official estimates show that the net migration in the year up to June of 2023 was about 672,000. And I've got a slide here to show you some of these figures. So 672,000 who have come in up to June of 2023. But we also see in June of 2023 the top 5 non-EU nationalities for immigration in the UK. And you can see those here. Indian, Nigerian, Chinese, Pakistani, Ukrainian, of course, are now coming in at a rate that we had not seen in the past. EU nationals who are coming in to work, about 50,000 in 2023. That's down from what it was pre-Brexit. And as of September 2023, individuals having been given refugee status is about at 38,000, close to 39,000 at this point. About 48% of the country's foreign-born population live in London or the southeast of England. Most of those are actually, that 48%, most of them are living in London. So I want to take a minute to talk about this very interesting building. When I do my London churches course, we spend more time on this. But this is the Brick Lane Mosque. It's in Spitalfields. If you recall, we visited Spitalfields when we had the Georgian lecture. This was first built, it was constructed in 1743, and it has passed through the hands of 3 major religions from 1743 to today. And I wanted to point it out because it really stands as a symbol for the history of migration, particularly to London's East End, to this area. So as we talked about in the Georgian period, there was a big influx of Huguenot refugees coming from France, religious refugees coming from France, arriving in England, and a lot of them settled in Spitalfields in the East End of London. And they set up businesses there. So this church, this building actually started as a church, as a chapel, as a chapel for the French Huguenots. But over time, the French Huguenots, they made good money, they got more prosperous, they moved out of the East End of London into better areas, and therefore they moved out, and in 1819, this building passed into the hands of several different Christian denominations. It was, I think, a Methodist chapel for a while. But then in 1897, the building was acquired by a group of Orthodox Lithuanian Jews, because again, as I said, there had been this migration, mostly Russian and Polish Jews, but we also had Lithuanian Jews coming in at this time period. And again, a lot of the Jewish population settled in the East End of London. Again, they ended up working in and then later running their own textile firms. So then it became a synagogue. But again, like the Huguenots, once they became more prosperous, once they became more settled, the Jewish migrants eventually moved out to wealthier suburbs. Then that brings us up to the 1950s and 60s, and we started seeing a lot of Bangladeshi and Pakistanis starting to settle around this area in Brick Lane, including some Bengalis. And in 1976, the synagogue had kind of sat empty for a while. And then in 1976, they turned it into a mosque, and that's what it is today. It's the Brick Lane Mosque. So I think has a very interesting history, that it's gone through all these different waves of migration in London's history. And I'm going to come back to immigration a little later when we talk about the war years, but I did want to point out this very interesting building. Okay, so to talk about some of the key events that were going on in London, I'm going to start with one from the early 20th century, and this was the suffragette movement. A little bit of background, if you don't know about this. In 1903, the Votes for Women campaign was created or really energized by the creation of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. And this was founded in Manchester by Emmeline Pankhurst, who some of you have probably heard of, along with her daughters, Christabel, Sylvia, and Adela. And they really wanted to raise awareness of the cause of women's suffrage. They decided to relocate their headquarters to London in 1906, and this really transformed their movement. For the next 8 years, they fought to win the right to vote. It became a very highly public fight, at times a very violent struggle, and they took their campaign to the streets. They got maximum publicity by doing this, a lot of visibility by taking to the streets. They were very identifiable by their purple, white, and green color scheme. I don't have a picture of that, unfortunately. And they became a very familiar sight in central London. And by moving to London, which, look, this was the political heart of the nation, right? So this meant that they could maintain a constant presence in Whitehall, where the government was. They could petition at Downing Street. They were heckling MPs who were going in and out of the Houses of Parliament. They chained themselves to government buildings. So they had a very visible presence. And the WSPU established 90 branches throughout the UK, but London really did remain their chief area of support. They had 34 local offices in London. And as we're going to see a little bit later, London really does provide the perfect setting for staging spectacular demonstrations. And the leaders of the suffragette movement really took full advantage of this. Now, in June of 1908, the first what they called monster meeting to be held by the WSPU brought suffragettes from all over the United Kingdom to march in 7 different processions throughout central London. They all marched to Hyde Park. The demonstration attracted a crowd of up to 300,000 people, which was quite a lot for 1908. And then the coronation of George V in 1911, King George V, this inspired the WSPU to organize its own coronation pageant. So they said, let's have our own coronation. So they had a 4-mile-long procession through central London. They ended up with a rally at the Royal Albert Hall, which we looked at last week, that building, and that they had over 60,000 delegates at that rally. But over time, their campaign became increasingly militant. By 1911, women were breaking windows, including shop windows on Oxford Street and Regent Street and along the Strand, so the upscale shopping areas. They were setting fire to post office boxes in the city and in the West End. Over 1,000 suffragettes, including Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, received prison sentences for their actions. Many were sent to Holloway Prison in North London, a very notorious, not very nice prison, not that any of them are. And they protested against the conditions. They had very poor conditions. They protested against these conditions. They went on hunger strike, and many of them were force-fed. Now, when World War I hit, this kind of brought an immediate suspension of the militancy that the suffragettes were doing at this time. And they actually threw themselves into supporting the war effort. And the WSPU, in the end, they did not succeed in achieving the vote, but the way they campaigned, the way they raised visibility for women, this did ease the way for women to take a more active and public role in society, particularly during the war. They got very engaged during the war. And because of this, their role was recognized, the role of women was recognized and acknowledged. Parliament granted them the right to vote. Any woman who was propertied and over the age of 30 could vote as of 1918. So part of that was in recognition of the fact that they were supporting the country, that they were more visible, that kind of thing. Today, you can see a couple of tributes or a couple of symbols of Emmeline Pankhurst, if you will. This first one on the left, this is in Victoria Tower Gardens, right near the Houses of Parliament. This is a sculpture that was unveiled in 1930. I'm sure Emmeline would have loved this because it was unveiled by the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, who had opposed votes for women. And musicians from the Metropolitan Police, some of whom had arrested the suffragettes during demonstrations, played at the ceremony. So that's rather ironic, but you can go see that statue today. And then on the right is actually the grave of Emmeline Pankhurst. This is in Brompton Cemetery in Chelsea at the northern end of the cemetery. Pankhurst died in 1928, a month before all adult women could finally vote in elections. So unfortunately, she did not see this happen. She did not see hang on just 1 minute. Oh, so he grabbed it. Never mind. I was going to grab that phone. So she did not see all of her efforts come to fruition. But shortly thereafter, all adult women could finally vote in elections. Now, I wanted to point this out too. This is in the Houses of Parliament. Remember, we talked about Westminster Hall, that old medieval part, maybe one of the only parts left of the old Whitehall Palace. If you walk into Westminster Hall, and you go down to the end of the hall, you turn to the left, that's where you go upstairs to start a tour of the Houses of Parliament. And as you're going through the doorway, as you're going into St. Stephen's Hall, you'll see this installation, this art installation above the doorway. It's called New Dawn. It was commissioned as a permanent addition to the Parliamentary Art Collection. It's the first piece of abstract art that was commissioned for permanent display in this historic palace. Measures almost 20 feet high, and it's intended, the height of it, the scale of it is intended to reflect the size of the suffragette campaign. And that these are all hand-blown glass scrolls, and they make up what they say it's to symbolize the dawning sun reflecting the many individuals who were involved in the suffragette movement. And you'll notice they're different colors. The multiple colors used here reflect the numerous organizations that were involved in the suffragette movement. And it's a very interesting display. I obviously got to see it in person, but I also got to hear the artist speak at the Corning Museum of Glass a few years ago. And basically, she set it up in such a way, her name was Mary Branson, the artist, set it up in such a way that the lights reflect, they go over a 12.5 hour cycle, and they're linked to the tide of the Thames. So the ebb and flow of the illumination that you see on here reflects the tide of the Thames, which is supposed to show the ever-rising tide of change that the campaigners for suffrage were certain would bring women the vote. And each scroll is individually lit, and the appearance of this artwork changes minute by minute because of the tide. So you can see on the left, I can't remember, I took the two pictures on the left and right. The center one is when it's all lit up. That's not my photograph. I can't remember which one I took going into the Houses of Parliament and which one I took coming out, but you can see how they changed as the tide changed. So it's quite an installation. Okay, now I want to talk about the war years. The years 1914 to 18 during World War I, London was luckier in some ways than other European countries. The war was not as disruptive as it was for other European cities. London wasn't close to the front line like Paris was. It didn't suffer near starvation like Berlin. There was no political revolution like we saw in St. Petersburg. And unlike Constantinople, it was never subjected to military occupation. But nonetheless, it did suffer bombings on a scale that is often overlooked because when we think of London and air raids and bombs from the air, we usually think about World War II. And certainly World War II was a much deadlier war in terms of bombing on London. But there was bombing in London during the First World War, and a lot of times people don't even know that or they overlook it. And this was really, the first time that civilians were under fire, if you will, in this type of way. And at the start of the war, Britain was really ill prepared to deal with the threat from enemy airships and aircraft because traditionally its home defense focused on defending the coastline. It was an island, it was defending the coastline. It didn't think that much about the airspace. And actually, during the First World War, the Royal Flying Corps were operating overseas. So there were very few aircraft remaining to defend Britain at this time. And what we saw happen was initially London was under attack by these hydrogen-filled Zeppelins. And these Zeppelins could travel at 85 miles an hour. They carried 2 tons of explosives. Now, for years before the war, these airships had been used to carry civilians on pleasure cruises, pleasure aerial cruises. But in the early months of World War I, the German military began using them for bombing raids. And the first one reached London on May 31st, 1915. And you can see 31st, 1915, and you can see here the plaque denoting that. And they didn't want to cause panic with this, right? So initially, British civil authorities said, okay, we don't want to panic people. So they gave very few air raid warnings. Basically, the air raid warnings consisted mostly of policemen on bicycles bicycling around, riding around, blowing whistles and shouting, take cover, which wasn't very effective overall. And technology was also limited as to what Britain could do to stop these Zeppelins early in the war because the airplanes they had could not go as high up as these Zeppelins. The Zeppelins were very lightweight. They were lighter than traditional aircraft, so they could be quite high in the air. So machine gun fire also had no effect on them. So it was very difficult for them to battle these. On the 8th of September 1915, a Zeppelin passed over the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. It unloaded a 3-ton bomb, the largest ever dropped at that time on the city of London. And the attack caused massive damage. It killed 22 civilians, including 6 children. And this Zeppelin raid would be the worst of the war on London, the worst Zeppelin raid. Britain instituted blackouts. They installed massive searchlights to look for these aircraft. Anti-aircraft defenses were diverted from the front lines in France, brought back into Britain and around the capital. Authorities even drained the lake in St. James's Park to prevent nighttime glitter from directing the Zeppelins to nearby Buckingham Palace, because St. James Park is right next door. And they thought with the moon and with these ships, they might see the water, they might see the palace that way. So they drained the lake. And in the capital, 181 people were killed and 504 were injured by Zeppelin raids. So they were serious raids. By the following autumn, the British had developed planes that could fly at the Zeppelin's altitude. And so therefore you had pilots and they were able to get up here. They were able to shoot holes in the skin of these airships and they caused the airships to catch fire. The Zeppelins caught fire. Now, the Zeppelin raids continued on London, but they were far less frequent than they had been. But by 1917, Germany started using heavy biplane bombers instead. And that spring, the Germans carried out their first large-scale daylight raids involving these Gotha bombers, as they were called. And the most destructive of these, this raid took place on the 13th of June, and they killed 162 people and injured 426. So again, the Germans were now ratcheting it up. They were moving to these other planes instead and causing a lot of damage. And in total, the German air raids on London killed 667 people and injured 1,936. And the estimate of material damage at that time was around 2.2 million pounds. So quite serious. So again, here are just some numbers overall. And you can see bomb damage here. Now, since we're discussing World War I want to return to the topic of immigration in London. Just before the start of the war, Germans were long established both in the East End of London and in the West End and in the suburb communities. There were a dozen German churches. There was a Salvation Army German Corps. There was a German hospital, two German language newspapers, German merchants and traders and stockbrokers and bankers. They had all carved out important roles for themselves in the city of London. You had German governesses working in many upper class homes. You had German waiters and bakers and barbers, tradesmen, everybody. So they were, you know, a large part of London's economic life, a lot of Germans living in London. And they had intermarriage with English women, quite high rates of intermarriage with English women. And, you know, they were happy to stay in London rather than return back to Germany. So they were very integrated. It was a very integrated community into Britain at this time. But August 1914 and the onset of the war would change all of that. We started seeing sporadic violence against German shopkeepers, particularly in the poorer trading streets of London. This began almost immediately after the declaration of war. In October 1914, the first really serious outbreak of collective violence by Londoners began. There were crowds of up to 5,000 individuals, and they were so strong that the police had to call out the military for assistance. They couldn't control them themselves. They had up to 5,000 people on the streets. And you were seeing butcher and baker shops being wrecked and looted. There were very alarming riots going on. And at the time, riots had also been triggered in part by the arrival in South London of Belgian refugees fleeing from the fall of Antwerp. So there was a lot of anger against the Germans. Worse was to come, however. On the 7th of May, 1915, the Cunard Line RMS Lusitania was torpedoed off of Ireland at the loss of, was it over almost 1,200 lives, I believe, including many women and children, and 124 US citizens, by the way. This really shocked and horrified the whole world, and the news reached London pretty quickly in the evening papers. And then over the weekend of the 8th and 9th of May, we started seeing some very serious anti-German riots breaking out. First in Liverpool, because that was the Lusitania's home port. But then it drifted down to London. Parts of East London on May 11th started having problems. There were big riots, fires and things going on by Wednesday the 12th. A big violence took place over 6 days. The Metropolitan Police divisions across London experienced a wave of violent disturbances. At least 257 people were injured, including 107 police officers. And these police officers were beaten for standing between the Germans and the crowd. There were 866 arrests. Now, miraculously, nobody was killed, but shops that were thought to have been run by Germans or Austrians had their windows smashed, their doors broken down, interiors like staircases, cupboards, ceilings, they were hacked to pieces. People were looting, they were taking the provisions and actually properties of some of these shop owners, because many of the shop owners lived above the shops. They were going in and they were just carrying things out by the barrelful. So there was a lot of looting, a lot of violence. Some Germans were actually chased into their homes by the mobs and then thrown through windows into the street. Others had clothing ripped off their backs. Now, during the war, many German and Austrian citizens, civilians who were not naturalized in the UK, they were interned and treated as military prisoners of war, and others were repatriated and sent away. English women who married non-naturalized German civilians were also interned. So even if you were a British-born, British passport holder, British citizen, if you were married to a non-naturalized German, you too were interned. German-born Londoners were thrown out of work, and not just from not just from the shopkeepers and the restaurant waiters and the governesses. Prince Louis of Battenberg, the first Sea Lord, he was married to a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. He was forced out of the Admiralty by the press. So there were letters signed, anonymous letters calling for his dismissal. He was forced out. German surnames became anglicized or abandoned, and that included the royal family, whose name up to this point had been Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and they changed their name to Windsor after Windsor Castle. That's how we got the House of Windsor. And the House of Commons said, okay, there are not going to be any clerks employed in the Treasury who are of German or Austrian nationality. So a big wave against them. In the end, the German and Austrian population in London fell significantly. In 1911, the census at that time had recorded 31,254 German-born residents in the County of London. In 1921, the number had fallen to 9,083. And we saw the same thing with Austrians. So at the beginning in 1911, the census showed 8,869 Austrians, dropped down to 1,552 by 1921. Now we would see internment take place again during the Second World War, and we'll talk about the Second World War in just a second here. Here's another picture. So you can see here, someone has broken into the house apartment of one of these Germans or Austrians and throwing their goods out the window to the crowds below. And the police are, pretty helpless. They can't do much. They're so vastly outnumbered. All right. So moving on to World War II, Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. But it really wasn't until the following year that the war came directly to London itself, with the arrival, again, of German air raids. This time, London and the rest of the country were a little bit more prepared. They had blackouts, they had gas masks, they had air raid drills, and they were prepared pretty much from the start. And things actually stayed pretty quiet until around August of 1940. And also, unlike the start of World War I, Britain was more well prepared for an air battle this time around. They had an early warning radar. It was the most advanced system in the world at that time. And it gave the flight command adequate notice of where and when to direct their forces. So the Luftwaffe really never made a concerted effort to neutralize that system. The RAF's Spitfire was a superlative fighter. But nonetheless, German bombers did hit London, and they hit it with a fierceness that had not been experienced in the past. Although there were a few bombs that dropped in August 1940, it really wasn't until the afternoon of September 7th, 1940, that the London Blitz, as it was called, commenced. For 2 hours, 348 German bombers and 617 fighters targeted the city, dropping high explosive bombs as well as incendiary devices. Later, guided by these fires that were caused by the first attack, a second group of planes began another raid that lasted until 4:30 the following morning. So in just a few hours, 430 people were killed, 1,600 were badly injured, 1,200 people were killed in the first 3 days of the bombing, and this started 57 straight nights of bombing in London. The raids predominantly targeted the Docklands area of the East End, and you can see a photo here of all the smoke rising up in that area. This was the hub of industry and trade, so this was seen as a legitimate target for the Germans. 25,000 bombs were dropped on the port of London alone. But the Docklands was also a very densely populated and impoverished area where thousands of working class Londoners lived in pretty much slum conditions. So it wasn't just that the docks were there, people were living there as well. And so they were badly affected by this as well. The raids obviously hurt Britain's war production. But again, as I said, because so many people were living there, it killed many civilians. It left many people homeless. A charitable relief fund was set up for the people of London, and there were contributions coming in from all over the world to help these people at this time. Plans were quickly made to house those that were left homeless by attacks. Funds were allocated to local municipalities to construct public air raid shelters. And the Air Raid Precautions Act, they had a department, and they distributed more than 2 million of these Anderson shelters, which you see one here. These were named after Sir John Anderson, who was the head of the Air Raid Precautions Department. And these were handed out to households. They were made of corrugated steel. They were designed to be dug into a garden and then covered with dirt. And you can see them working on them here. And they were good protection from bomb fragments and debris, but they were cold, they were damp, they were not suited for prolonged use. And because basements were relatively rare in Britain, the ARP devised the Morrison shelter, and this was named for Home Secretary Herbert Stanley Morrison. And they devised these as an alternative to the Anderson shelter. And this was essentially, as you can see here in this picture, just kind of a cage. It's like this low steel cage Supposedly it could hold 2 adults and 2 children, but it looks pretty cozy to me to fit that many people in there. And it was designed to be set up indoors. So and supposedly it would save you if your building began to collapse. You could hole up in there. Now, in the first days of the Blitz, a very tragic incident in the East End happened, and it really stoked public anger over the government's shelter policy at this time. So after the bombing began, we started seeing this bombing on September 7th that I mentioned. Local authorities urged displaced people to take shelter at the South Hallsville School. And this is what you see on the left here, what was left of it. Those who sought refuge at the school were told that they would quickly be relocated to a safer area, but for the time being, get out and go to this school. But the evacuation was delayed. And on September 10th, 1940, the school was flattened by a German bomb. You can see what it looks like here. You had a bunch of people huddled in the basement. They were killed or they were trapped in the rubble. And the government announced that 77 people had died, but for years, local residents insisted the toll was much higher. And now revised estimates that were made decades later indicated that close to 600 men, women, and children were killed in that bombing. So that brought a lot of anger on toward the government as to why these people were not relocated more quickly. It's believed that the wartime government covered up the death toll because they were afraid this was going to have an impact on public morale if they let it be known what really happened. But I think the public could see for themselves. Certainly the public in that area could see for themselves. So the South Hallsville school disaster prompted Londoners, especially residents of the East End, to find safer shelters on their own. And many began to take refuge in the city's underground rail stations. Now, this option had originally been forbidden by city officials. They said, nope, once people start sleeping in the underground stations, they would be reluctant to return to the surface and resume daily life. We don't want them taking over the underground stations. But as more and more people began sleeping on the platforms, the government relented. They provided bunk beds and bathrooms for these underground communities, and you can see some on the right here. During the Blitz, 177,000 Londoners sheltered in the London Underground. But this wasn't the first time that they used the tube stations, the underground stations, as a bomb shelter, because in a 12-month period between 1918, actually with the year 1918, throughout that year, over 300,000 people used the underground for the same purpose. So they were also using it as a bomb shelter back in World War I. One of the worst raids that was carried out in London during the Blitz was on the 29th of December, 1940. German bombers hit the city, that old square mile that we talked about, that we've been talking about for weeks. They hit the city with 124,000 bombs, including at least 100,000 incendiary bombs. And the fires joined together this conflagration. It spread all the way from Islington to the edges of St. Paul Cathedral. Firefighters battled the blaze until the following afternoon. St. Paul's miraculously escaped with only minor damage, but the Houses of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, the Guildhall, and the Tower of London were all damaged. Nonetheless, as we know and we've heard time and again, Londoners are very resilient. They had this keep calm and carry on attitude. And so a couple of these photos really demonstrate that. The one on the left is from a barber shop, and a barber with obviously a really good sense of humor. His windows were blown out by the bombs, but he said, we're no washout. Try our famous high explosive haircuts. They're a knockout. And then on the right, he said, close shave, sir. And then the photograph on the right is a milkman still making his rounds through the destroyed streets of London. So the resilience is still well known to this day, what Londoners put up with and managed to live through. So again, here are some statistics. I want to talk about the last and the most devastating raid on London. This took place the 10th into the 11th of May, 1941. It was a full moon. The Thames had a very low tide at that point. So these really helped the efforts by the Germans to fly in to see what they were doing. 571 flights by German bombers that night, 711 tons of high explosive bombs, and 167 that were recorded as unexploded the next day. At least 2,100 more than 2,100 fires, over 1,400 people killed, 1,800 seriously injured, and 700 acres of destruction, about double that of the Great Fire of London that we looked at in the Stuart period. So just massive devastation. Buckingham Palace was damaged by raids on 14 different occasions during the war. And the one I was talking about on the 10th and 11th of May caused the greatest damage to the palace. And you can see the king and queen standing here among the damaged areas. And you can see this huge crater on the right in the forecourt, in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. And the queen was said to have remarked that now we can look the East End in the face. Because the East End had gotten so much bombing that they felt now that they, could look the East End in the face. The Commons chamber was hit by bombs, as well as the roof of Westminster Hall. The roof caught on fire, and the fire service said it couldn't save both, so it decided to concentrate on saving Westminster Hall. A small bomb struck what we now call the Elizabeth Tower, Big Ben, as you know it, broke all the glass on the south face of the clock, but the clock and the bells were undamaged, and the chimes continued on as they had. So overall, the Blitz, which lasted from September 1940 to May of 1941, 43,000 civilians were killed across the country, and 1 in 6 Londoners were left homeless. German bombing recommenced in 1944. This is when we started seeing the V-1 doodlebugs and the V-2 rockets. They caused significant damage to London, and they were really greatly feared by Londoners, because this doodlebug, the V-1, the doodlebug or buzz bomb as they were called, had a design flaw. And basically what happened was the engines cut out before it hit its target. So people could hear these planes coming, and they knew when it was about to strike because the engines would cut out. So it was terrifying. People only had a few seconds before this massive explosion. And the V-2s were even more frightening, because they didn't have this design flaw, so nobody knew quite when they were about to strike, and they were virtually impossible to defend against or shoot down. They were pretty amazing. So the first set of V-1s launched in June of 1944. The V-2 rockets launched against England in September of 44, and over the next few months, 1,400 struck London. So again, some stats overall: 30,000 Londoners killed. Half were killed during that blitz in 1940. 1 million homes damaged, 100,000 destroyed. And you can still see bomb damage today. So if you go over to the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, where I took these photos, you can see the craters in the building that are still there from the bomb damage. And there's a sign talking about this. And in the museums and monuments class that I offer, we do talk about how these museums prepared and protected their collections during these bombings. And this is interesting. You don't see this much in London. You don't see many of these very kind of just open, unbuilt on space in London. I'm surprised this one's still here. But when you do, sometimes they've now put petrol stations, gas stations on them. But sometimes this is on Tottenham Court Road. I took this a few years ago. As far as I know, it hasn't been built on. It's just this blank open area, and someone's painted this mural in the background. This was a bombing site, and you can identify them that way because you don't see many of these, but this was a site where a bomb hit and nothing was ever built on it for whatever reason. Couple of places to go to learn more about World War II and what was happening. Churchill's War Room, they have a museum there as well, but this was the underground bunker where he ran the government from during World War II. Fascinating tour. Again, I talk about that in the Museums and Monuments course. And the Imperial War Museums, one of which is in London, and lots of great information there on both of the wars. Now, I want to mention one more thing about immigration, and that involves a group of immigrants collectively dubbed the Windrush generation. They arrived in the UK from the Caribbean countries between 1948 and 1973. Many took up jobs in the new national health system and other sectors that were affected by Britain's post-war labor shortage. And their name, Windrush, derives from the HMT Empire Windrush ship that brought the first of this large group of Caribbean people to the UK in 1948. Now, at this time, the Caribbean was part of the British Commonwealth, so those who arrived were automatically dubbed British citizens. They were free to permanently live and work in the UK. But a scandal began to emerge in 1917. Hundreds of Commonwealth citizens, many of whom were from this Windrush generation, had been wrongly detained, deported, or denied legal rights. And this came about due to a policy that was announced in 2012, which tasked the national health system, landlords, banks, other employers with enforcing immigration controls. And because many of this generation arrived as children and they arrived on their parents' passports, and the Home Office had destroyed thousands of landing cards and other records, many of these children who were children at the time, they didn't have documentation as adults to prove that they had a right to remain in the UK. And the Home Office also placed the burden of proof on these individuals to prove their residency predated 1973. So they had to have one official document from every year they had lived in the UK from 1973, which how many of us could even, pull that up now if we were children in 1973? Attempting to find documents from decades ago created a huge and in many cases impossible burden on these people who had basically done nothing wrong. They were in the UK legally. But they were falsely deemed as illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants. They began to lose their access to housing, to healthcare, to their bank accounts. They lost their driver's licenses. Many were placed in immigration detention. They were prevented from traveling abroad. They were threatened with forcible removal. And others were deported to countries they hadn't seen since they were children, maybe since they were babies, completely foreign to them. This turned out to be a huge scandal. Calls were made for justice for these individuals. Compensation was finally agreed upon, apologies were made, but there is still a huge backlog of cases that are still being sifted through at this time. Now, as for how London was impacted by this, there's a reading from the Museum of London in your reading list this week. And I will say, London just named all of its overground stations, and one of the stations is named Windrush. It just came out the other day. Okay, so we talked about the Great Exhibition of 1851 when we talked in the Victorian lecture. Well, in 1951, just 6 years after World War II, Britain's towns and cities were still showing the scars of war. Actually, that went on for a very long time. The first time I arrived in London, and as I said, you could still see some scars, but there was still a lot of evidence of damage, even the first time I was in London. And so this was a constant reminder, even though the war was over, a constant reminder of the turmoil of what the country had been through. So with the aim of promoting the feeling of recovery, the Festival of Britain opened to the public on the 4th of May in 1951 to celebrate British industry, arts, and sciences. So just like the Great Exhibition, and it coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Great Exhibition of 1851. The main site of the festival was a 27-acre area on the South Bank. Now, throughout its history, the South Bank had endured fire, floods, slum clearance, railway demolition, bombing, the ebb and flow of investment in industry. It was not a great area. So this became very popular. It was a great place to build on this site. The festival ran for 5 months. The only feature that remains today is the Royal Festival Hall, which is part of the South Bank Center, which is Europe's largest art complex. And that includes the Royal Elizabeth Hall, the Purcell Room, and the Hayward Gallery. And the Royal Festival Hall, you can go in there. The foyers are open to the public all day, 7 days a week. They have free exhibitions. They have lunchtime concerts, evening jazz performances. They have shops and restaurants, and they even have a singing elevator. So if you go in the elevator and you start, I have a recording of this, but it's not a very good recording because people kept getting on and talking while I was recording. If you get down to the bottom, it's a bass voice that says level 1. I can't sing. And then each floor you go up, the voices get higher. It's a little chorus, and they get higher and higher until they get to, I don't know, 6 or 7, whatever the top floor is. But then it's a falsetto saying level 7. So it's kind of fun to ride around. And there it is. There's the Royal Festival Hall. Very, very quickly, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but London, again, after the Festival of Britain opened, in 1952, they suffered a great smog in December of 1952. Now, you recall we've talked about air pollution in London and pollution in London in general going back through the centuries. This smog killed 4,000 Londoners and made 100,000 ill. And it was thought to have killed another 6,000 as a direct result in the following months, people who died later. It was triggered by a period of very cold weather. And so you had all these airborne pollutants, mainly from coal fires that were used to heat homes at the time. And this formed a very thick layer of smog over the city because, as when we talked about the frost fairs and the kind of mini ice age, the pollutants could not get out of the atmosphere. They were kind of trapped there. This resulted in the Clean Air Act of 1956, which restricted the burning of coal in urban areas and encouraged homes to shift toward cleaner coals, electricity, and gas for heating purposes. But you can see here this policeman with a mask on. And they said driving around and walking around in the daytime was very dangerous. It was like being out at midnight. It was very dark. You could hardly see anything. All right, now I want to move on to another cherry topic. I promise you we will get to better topics. And this is terrorism. In the 1980s and 90s, London experienced a multitude of bombings by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. And these included 2 bomb attacks in July that killed 11 people and wounded 50. And then there was a attack in December of 1983 at Harrods department store that killed 6 people. There were bombings before this by the Fenians, by different Irish militants, going all the way back to the 1800s. But in the 80s and 90s, even 70s, there were a lot of bombings going on in London, a lot of attack, and throughout other parts of the UK by the IRA. On February 7th, 1991, the IRA launched 3 rounds from a homemade mortar at number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence. None of them reached their target, but one did explode in the backyard, in the garden. And actually, at that time, the then Prime Minister, John Major, was meeting with his staff and his war cabinet because it was during the first Gulf War. So luckily that did not meet its target. And the picture you see here is the Bishopsgate bombing. Again, this is in the city, that 1 square mile, the city of London, when this bomb hit there. Now, things stayed relatively quiet for a while after that, but in the last 15 years, London has witnessed attacks of domestic terrorism. In July 2005, there were bombings on the London Underground and on a bus. There was a Westminster Bridge bombing, not bombing, but terrorist attack in 2017, where 6 died and 50 were injured. And I was in London just about 2 weeks after that attack. And then in June, just a couple months after that one, Borough Market in Southwark was attacked. 7 people were killed, 48 were injured. And then the London Bridge attack in 2019, where 2 died and 3 were injured. And there have been small little attacks since then. But this was from the Westminster Bridge attack in March of 2017. As I said, I arrived a couple weeks later. And you can see on Parliament Green, right across from the Houses of Parliament, because what happened was somebody drove across Westminster Bridge, hit people on the bridge, knocked people into the water, killed people with his car, got out of the car. And on the right here is this police constable, Keith Palmer, who was killed. He was guarding the Houses of Parliament and he was stabbed and killed. So there were still 2-3 weeks later, many flower tributes. This really caught my attention because police departments from all over the world in support of this constable who died sent their badges and they were displayed. And the one on the left really caught my attention because the Niagara region is where I spent a lot of time in Canada. Niagara on the Lake, that region up there around Niagara Falls. So they sent one, and of course the fire department from the city of New York sent one. They certainly had their share. They knew what terrorism was like. And people were, again, they had this whole campaign saying we are not afraid, and they had an online campaign where they were posting pictures. And I liked this hashtag, Hope Not Hate. And school children from France who were here wrote a tribute, and they all signed their names. People put flowers on the bridges. People from different parts of England came down to visit. There's that "We Are Not Afraid" symbol, and wrote about their feelings about this. So it's very touching to walk around and read these. All right, that brings us to protests. As we saw during the suffragette movement, London is a popular location for protests. and demonstrations, and there have been multiple ones over the years. I'm only going to talk about a couple of these in passing because, again, I don't have time for everything. The first one I wanted to mention began in Brixton in South London in April of 1981. This turned into a riot that really shocked the nation. The nation had not seen this kind of very violent this type of protest for a very long time. And whoever is talking, please mute your mic. Someone's got their mic on, please. For 3 days, there were rioters, predominantly young Black men. They fought the police, they attacked buildings, they set fires to vehicles. You can see a police vehicle here. And this was in protest against racial discrimination by white police. What they saw as racial discrimination by white police. More than 300 people were injured. The damage came to over 7 million pounds, about 7.5 million pounds. So this was quite jarring to the country and to London. And this was a very interesting one, and it's amazing that this one didn't get more out of hand. In 2010, the Rolls-Royce, in which then Prince Charles and his wife, the Duchess of Cornwall, were riding, became separated from its police escort and was attacked during a wave of protests that was sweeping through central London at the time. This protest was because the House of Commons had voted to force triple university tuition for students in England. So tripling the amount of tuition for students in England. There were huge protests going on. I don't know how this car got separated. I'm sure people lost their jobs over this. Up to 20 protesters surrounded the car. They were chanting off with their heads. They were chanting Tory scum, the conservative government, Tories scum. They rocked the car. They kicked the car. They hit the car with paint bombs. They broke a window. They actually, on the right, you can see, this is where Camilla was sitting. They took a pole and smashed it right through the window. How it didn't hit her, I don't know. How they didn't knock the car over, how it didn't get more out of hand, I don't know. But you can see the shocked look on their faces on the left here. And, protests continue. A few years ago, there were daily protests outside the Houses of Parliament over Brexit. More recent protests have focused on climate change, and most recently on the Israeli-Gaza war. So protests continue. There's just some pictures. This was protesting about the war in Ukraine. And that brings us to pageantry. So over the centuries, London has witnessed numerous occasions of spectacle and pageantry. And from the medieval period onward, royal weddings, coronations, and funerals have processed through the streets of London. We talked in the Tudor period about the Lord Mayor's Day Parade that drew crowds to London, and today's no different. So national occasions, both solemn and joyous, are always marked by these parades and processions. And Britain's current royal family, the House of Windsor, have given us many examples of royal pageantry over the last few decades. One of which was, of course, the Queen's coronation on June the 2nd, 1953. There have been 5 coronations in the time period we're covering today, but this is the one I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes on. Just under 30,000 men took part in this procession. There were 3,600 from the Royal Navy, 16,000 from the Army, and 7,000 from the RAF. And then you had 2,000 from the Commonwealth. There were 6,700 reserve and administrative troops, 1,000 officers and men of military police. So, and then 7,000 police were drawn from 75 provincial forces. So huge, huge, huge procession, big gold coach. Again, I do a whole thing on coronations, so I'm not going to get into the whole coronation thing here, but it was a huge, huge spectacle for this time period. And likewise, there have been 7 royal weddings set in London in the 20th and 21st centuries, but perhaps the most memorable was that of the then Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer on July 29th, 1981. It was the largest royal event in decades, and it was the first for individuals who were too young to remember the Queen's coronation. Maybe they weren't even born at that point yet. So this was this was my big, I would say, royal moment, royal event, because I wasn't around for the Queen's coronation. 600,000 people lined the streets as the couple made their trip from Clarence House to St. Paul's Cathedral. The princess came, future princess came, and she was in this fairy tale gold coach. And they were married at St. Paul's, which was the first royal wedding to be held on that site in almost 500 years. The last one before that was in the medieval St. Paul's Cathedral in 1501 when Prince Arthur, who was the eldest son of Henry VII, he married Catherine of Aragon. He was Henry VIII's brother. He was the one that died after only a few months of being married. There were over 3,500 guests who attended the wedding. That's why they had it in St. Paul's, because it was bigger than Westminster Abbey. You had monarchy and heads of state from around the world, and then you saw the couple process through the streets in an open carriage, and with everybody cheering them on. And as with the Trooping the Color and other important royal or national occasions, the couple made an appearance on the Buckingham Palace balcony, the famous balcony, to wave at everybody, and the crowds swarmed there to see them. This one was another fun event. This was during the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012, and it was a river parade of 670 boats on the Thames. This was part of a year-long multinational celebration of the 60th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's accession to the throne. And the pageant drew its inspiration from the painting of the Lord Mayor's Day on the Thames by a Venetian painter, Canaletto. And so they say, hey, let's do this. Let's recreate this kind of river procession. And 7.5 miles long, it passed under 14 of London's bridges. It started from Wandsworth Bridge, just west of Chelsea, and it finished at Tower Bridge. There were large ships, power boats, sailing vessels, rowboats, and the procession was made up of a number of flotillas, each preceded by a musical barge made up of choirs and bands. Even the London Philharmonic took part. There were over 1 million spectators on the banks of the Thames watching this. The event was carried live on national television. And there was a royal barge created. A Portuguese company actually ended up buying the royal barge, and now it's being used for international luxury river cruises. But you can see it was very almost medieval looking in some ways with all of these vessels. And you can see all the people lined up here on the Millennium Bridge watching. Quite the sight to see. And there's the royal barge. And the bridge, it's absolutely packed with people. And there, just in the distance, is the Queen. Unfortunately, it wasn't a great day weather-wise, but the Queen surrounded by her family. Okay. The other thing, of course, that took place in London was the 2012 Olympics. They had 302 events, almost 11,000 athletes. Obviously, I took this one. This was at St. Pancras train station, and they had the Olympic rings on display. And if you haven't seen this, go look for it on YouTube. I don't have time to show it, but it's very funny. They did a little spot. The Queen was quite a good sport. She did a little spot where Daniel Craig playing James Bond comes to her, and she walks out with him. He escorts her out of Buckingham Palace. And then she gets on a plane with him. And then the opening ceremony of the Olympics, you see someone dressed like the Queen, obviously not the Queen, parachuting out of the plane in to open the Olympics. And then she walks in herself. So that was quite funny. And then the last Jubilee that was held for the Queen was her Platinum Jubilee. And that was the year before, well, just a few months actually before she died, just a few months before she died. And you can see here on the balcony here, this was marking 70 years on the throne. And again, with her son and grandson and their wives and Kate and William's children. And again, huge crowds turned out. It was a massive, big celebration. Sadly, just a few months after that, Elizabeth II died. So, London has seen all this pageantry, but also more somber events, such as royal funerals. Diana, Princess of Wales' funeral probably drew the largest crowds ever seen for such an event. But the most recent, of course, was that of Elizabeth II. She died on September the 8th, 2022. She was the longest reigning British monarch. She died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland after 70 years on the throne. And you can see on the left here, I can see if I can pull, I think I can. This was the announcement that was put on the gates of Buckingham Palace announcing that she had died. And as the news broke that evening across the UK and around the world, Londoners did what they always do during momentous events, including the end of World War II. They headed to Buckingham Palace and they congregated at Buckingham Palace. And this was quite a touching scene because, as you can see, the weather was lousy that night. It was pouring with rain, it was cold, and people just wanted to be there for whatever reason. So they were there, the umbrellas were open, and they just congregated and stood there in tribute. She wasn't even there. She was still in, her body was in Scotland, but they came to pay tribute to her. And we saw tributes to her on display throughout London. So Piccadilly Circus on the left here, this big billboard. Marks and Spencer, the well-known department store, had a big notice on one of their windows in London. And then just pubs and bakeries and things everybody had pictures. Everybody had pictures of the Queen. There were billboards on the highways. So shortly after her death, it was announced there'd be a period of mourning and a lying in of state. And this was a time during which the public could pay their respects to the Queen. And like other monarchs before her, including her parents and her grandfather, George V, and her grandmother, Queen Mary, she had a lying in state at Westminster Hall, that medieval remnant of Westminster Palace that was built by William II and renovated by Richard II, as we had discussed earlier in this series. And during that lying in state, you can see the coffin is raised on a platform, a raised platform. It's in the middle of Westminster Hall. Each corner of the platform is guarded around the clock, or was guarded around the clock, by units from the sovereign's bodyguard, foot guards, and the household cavalry, mounted regiments. At one point, just for a few minutes, her children each stood guard, as did her grandchildren. And the public were invited in to walk past the platform and pay their respects. And there's another shot that you can see there. Ooh, before I get to that, let me just talk about this some more. So more than 250,000 people filed past the Queen's coffin during the 5-day period that she was lying in state. And BBC News had a 24-hour live feed from inside Westminster Hall. So you could go on their website at any time, and they had cameras in there, and you could just see people very quietly filing through. Now, all of these lying in states are commemorated by tablets on the floor of the hall, and that's what I wanted to show you here. You could see, if you go in there now, you can see the tablets for George VI and Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, so the late Queen's parents. They're commemorated in there. I don't think the Queen's is there yet, but I haven't been back there since she died, so I don't know. The first lying in state that was conducted here was that of the former Prime Minister William Gladstone in 1898. And they used Westminster Hall rather than a religious building because they said, well, Gladstone had this long association with the Palace of Westminster, with the Houses of Parliament. And then another prime minister, Winston Churchill, not only had his lying in state here, he had a state funeral at Westminster Abbey, and that was very, very unusual for to have a state funeral for a non-royal, but he had one. So this was the route, as I said, 250,000 people. They lined up to file past her coffin. The queue, the line, the maximum length was 10 miles long. And you can see where it started and where it ended at the Palace of Westminster. And there was a 3-mile kind of zigzag through Southwark Park. So actually it was about 6.9 miles from end to end, but it ended up being 10 miles because they kind of zigzagged through. At the longest, the wait was more than 24 hours. Many people stood in line throughout the night. As a mark of respect and to pay tribute to the Queen, Tower Bridge and other London landmarks were lit in royal purple. And you can see Tower Bridge there in the background lit in purple. And you can see them kind of zigzagging here through the park. They were given colored wristbands, so you could leave to get a drink or go to the bathroom and then return. There were more than 500 portable toilets set up along the route. And local venues and museums, including the South Bank Center, the National Theatre, the British Film Institute, and Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, they stayed open for extended periods. Some of them stayed open for 24 hours a day to provide people with bathroom facilities and refreshments. And as well as that, some London train stations also remained open 24 hours, including King's Cross and London Victoria Station. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the street for the funeral at Westminster Abbey. And as with nearly all monarchs from George III onward, the Queen was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, and she shares a private chapel with her parents, her sister, Princess Margaret, and her husband, Prince Philip. And there's just part of the procession through the streets. And another tribute just by a store that, I think this was a pub that had a sign out. Which of course brings us immediately upon her death. You know, the king is dead, long live the king. In this case, the queen is dead, long live the king. By law, Charles, Prince of Wales, became King Charles III, oldest British monarch to come onto the throne. 2 days after his death, he was officially acclaimed king by the Accession Council at St. James's Palace, but his coronation ceremony didn't take place for several months. They always take a long time to plan. So he did not have his coronation until May of 2023. And again, protests. There are always protests. What happened here was, well, one thing that happened was at 2 in the morning on the day of the coronation, the police arrested 3 volunteers from the Westminster City Council, and they had been carrying, these volunteers had been carrying rape alarms. This was part of a program to stop sexual harassment of women. So they would walk around the streets in the middle of the night, and if they saw a woman by herself, they would give her a rape alarm. Now, the police claim they were acting on intelligence that these alarms might be used to frighten the horses that would be part of the coronation parade. The people who arrested these people, they were 3 people, they were in their 60s. As I said, they were volunteers. Ironically, the rape alarms were funded by the government, and the volunteers were wearing jackets with the logos of the parent organization, the sponsoring organization, which ironically was the Metropolitan Police. Nonetheless, these individuals were handcuffed for 3 hours, and they were held for 14 hours before they were released on no charges. And then a few hours later, 6 members of Republic, an anti-monarchy organization, they were arrested. And this was under a rather new Public Order Act, which came into effect, actually was signed by Charles III just a week before the coronation. Now, his assent is just a formality, but the timing right before the coronation kind of raised some eyebrows. And this new law criminalized some long-standing protest tactics, such as physically attaching yourself to things like buildings or roads. So this group, they were unloading their truck, and they had placards that they were going to hold up saying, "Abolish the monarchy, not my king." And the placards were held by these straps. And the police said, no, you were going to use those straps to lock yourself onto railings and things. So they arrested them. Again, ironically, the event organizer for this organization, for Republic, they'd been working with the Metropolitan Police, their protest liaison team. The police were aware that they were going to be doing this. They apparently had no problem. They gave their approval. And there were still lots of other people who ended up on that day carrying signs. But nonetheless, these people were arrested, but then they again were released without charge. But despite that, and some rainy weather, the day and the rest of the 3-day celebration went off smoothly. About 20 million people watched the coronation in the UK. There were tens of thousands of people in the street, happy to party and celebrate the day. All right, now I'm going to go very quickly, because we're already at almost 20 after, through some architecture. Lots of changing architecture, as I said, in London, the new mixing in with the old. But I did want to point out, again, a couple of places you may not be familiar with. This is St. Dunstan in the east. I love this. I love this. This is in the city of London. It's one of my favorite places. It was a church originally built in 1100. It was heavily damaged by the Great Fire in 1666. It was patched up. It was rebuilt in the early 1800s, but then it was heavily damaged in World War II bombing. And at that point, they said, we're just going to let it go. We're not going to rebuild it. But in 1967, it was opened as a municipal park. And I talk again more about this in the Parks and Gardens, London Parks and Gardens course. But it's this lovely little place with this remnants of this old church that you can sit, have your lunch, or there's a little fountain in the middle. Lots of office workers from the city come over here at lunchtime, as you can see, to just kind of sit and read and have their lunch or talk to one another. It's a peaceful little tiny oasis in the middle of this very busy, hustling, bustling financial district. It's a couple of other photos. Very popular, as you can see, especially during the week when people are working in the city. The city's pretty much a ghost town on the weekends. very atmospheric. Another one of my favorite places, this is in South Kensington, not far from the South Kensington Tube Station. This is the Michelin building that was built in 1911, and it was constructed as the first permanent UK headquarters and tire depot for the Michelin Tire Company. It is a real work of art. It has 3 large stained glass windows based on Michelin advertisements at the time. They all feature the Michelin Man, whose name was Bibendum. And around the front of the original building at the street level, there are a number of decorative tiles showing famous racing cars at the time that used Michelin tires. And then if you go inside, there are more tiles inside in the front of the building. The front of the building was originally a tire fitting bay for cars. People would drive their cars in to get their tires. There are 2 glass cupolas that look like a pile of tires. And the Michelin Company's close association with road maps and tourism is represented by a number of etchings of the streets of Paris on some of the first floor windows. Michelin moved out of the building in 1985. It now houses business offices and the Bibendum Restaurant and Oyster Bar, which is a very upscale, expensive place I have not eaten, but I've poked my head in there. But it is such a cool build. I love this building. I've got tons of pictures of this building. So there's Bibendum on his bike with his Michelin tires. And at night it's really cool too, because those little cupolas are lit up, everything's lit up. It's quite something to see. Okay. The BT Tower, built in 1964. It was the largest tower at the time it was built, originally built for the General Post Office for telecommunications. It was open to the public in the 1960s, but then closed in 1981 because of IRA bombings. And they used to have a revolving restaurant at the top. In 2009, a 360-degree full-color LED-based display system was installed at the top of the tower. And the new display, referred to by the BT as an information band, is wrapped around the 36th and 37th floors of the tower, largest type in the world. It's computer generated. It displays messages. So for example, on the 31st of October, 2009, it began displaying a countdown for the number of days until the start of the London Olympics in 2012. But it has suffered hiccups. In 2019, the display spent almost a day displaying a Windows operating system error message. And just yesterday, I believe, it was announced that the BT Tower has been sold and it's going to become a hotel in the near future. Yeah, this is so this shows you one of these displays. When Prince Harry and his wife Meghan had their first child, it displayed on here. It's a baby boy. The National Theater, the home of the National Theater, opened in 1963. Originally, the National Theater was housed in the old Vic Theater. Laurence Olivier was its first artistic directory. This building actually has 3 theaters within the complex. As with a lot of 20th and 21st century London architect, this one has a lot of critics. The architectural style was described by one prominent architect as the aesthetic of broken forms. And in 1988, Prince Charles, the then Prince Charles, who we know is not a fan of modern architecture, said it was a clever way of building a nuclear power station in the middle of London without anyone objecting. It's brutalist architecture. Love it or hate it, the National Theatre plays a pivotal role in London's rich theatrical heritage, and it stands out on the South Bank. You can't miss it. Another thing that really stands out is the London Eye. This was put up in 1999. It was meant to be a 5-year lease, but it was granted permanent status in 2002. It's no longer the highest view in London. It used to be. The Shard has overtaken that. Pieces of this were floated up the Thames on barges, just like those Roman walls. The stones that built the Roman walls came up on barges, so did this. It's the most popular paid tourist attraction in the UK. It has over 30 million visitors, or has had over 30 million visitors since 2008, and I'm sure that number is much higher now because that figure is a few years old now. It has 32 capsules, one for each of London's boroughs. And one of them is named the Coronation Capsule in honor of the 60th anniversary of the Queen's 60th year on the throne. And you can see that red one there. That's the one that's red. Quite long lines to get into. This was during the Olympics. One of the athletes actually up on the capsule with the torch. And again, it's lit up on different occasions for different, to commemorate different events. The Tate Modern, this was actually, I was thinking about Prince Charles talking about a nuclear power station. This was actually the former Bankside Power Station. It was closed in 1981. The Tate Modern opened in May of 2000, had massive renovations in 2009 and again in 2016. It's directly across the river from St. Paul's Cathedral. You don't have to like modern architecture, but go in here. It is free. You don't have to pay anything to go in. Go up to the 6th floor. There's a bar and restaurant up there. And if you sit in the bar, they have, I think I've got a picture of it. Do I have a picture of it? No, I guess I don't. They have a long kind of countertop. You can just get a brownie, cup of coffee, whatever, sit at that countertop. And when you look across the river, this is what you see. So you've got a really, I mean, again, things are building up around it, but you've got a good view of St. Paul's Cathedral, particularly that cupola there. So there's also a viewing platform at the top of the Tate Modern that you can get some really nice views across the city. And in addition to the Tate Modern, London's also the home of Tate Britain. That sits on the opposite side of the river in Millbank. And that has collections from the 1500s to the present, not quite as modern as the Tate Modern. And if you want to visit both museums, there's a boat that'll take you from one side of the river to the other. So you can pick it up at either the Tate Modern or the Tate Britain and skirt across the river. I mentioned, I think, the Millennium Footbridge before. This opened in 2000 originally, but then it was shut down and opened in 2002. This was as a result of a competition held by the Southwark Council in conjunction with the Financial Times and the Royal Institute of British Architects. It was the first new bridge built over the Thames for more than 100 years. It's 1,066 feet long, cost over $23 million. The day it opened, over 10,000 people crossed it, but it soon became apparent that something was very wrong with it. It's a suspension bridge. Now, there was no risk of falling off of it, but it was very wobbly and it made people feel uneasy. It made them feel seasick. Some people actually fell over. So they closed it immediately and they didn't open it for another 2 years. They had to rework it. But you can walk from St. Paul's Cathedral, as you can see here, straight across the bridge, right over to the Tate Modern today. Super quick, just some newer buildings in the past decades. The Gherkin, calls this because it looks like a pickle. This was built between 2002 and 2004, 41 stories high. It is now dwarfed. You can barely see it anymore. I actually like this building, but you can barely see it because of all the new buildings around it. The Shard, I also really like this one. This is 95 stories high. It's over 1,000 feet. It was designed by the Italian architect Renzo Piano. And originally he said he didn't like large buildings because he found them arrogant. But for the Shard, he drew his inspiration from church spires and from the masts of ships that once sailed on the Thames. It is now as recognized a part of London's skyline as St. Paul's Cathedral. I hate this one. I'm sorry, I hate it, even though it too is getting somewhat dwarfed. This is 20 Fenchurch Street, also known as the walkie-talkie. I hate the way it looms. This is one of my own photographs. This is not exaggerated. It loomed and looms over some of these buildings, 525 feet high. They had problems when they built this because all those windows, the sunlight reflected on them at a certain part of day. It knocked the sunbeams down onto the street and started causing car windows to melt and break. So they had to put some protective film over the windows so that would not happen in the future. There is actually a 360-degree uninterrupted view across the city of London from the Sky Garden. And the Sky Garden is very nice, I have to say. It's free, but you do have to book online. But here's the Sky Garden, and you can go up there. You don't have to eat up there. They do have food and things up there, but you can just get a ticket online for free and go up. And they do have, I have to say, some spectacular views across the city. And then the one that didn't make it, thank God, because again, this just looks like Dubai to me. I did not like this at all. This was the Tulip, a 1,000-foot tower that was initially approved by the City of London Corporation, but rejected by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, thank goodness. It was rejected because it said it would harm views of nearby World Heritage sites, including the Tower of London. It would stand out as different and less cohesive besides other local buildings. And it was going to use vast quantities of reinforced concrete for the foundation. and the lift shaft, the elevator shaft, and they thought that this would be highly unsustainable. It looks very space agey, looks very Dubai to me. Yeah, it didn't, I'm glad they didn't go with that one. Okay, so to wrap up, this was really a whirlwind tour through London's history, and we really only skimmed the surface. There are so many events and places I didn't cover, so many more churches to show, museums to talk about, parks to visit. But I do hope I achieved what I set out to do, which was to talk about both prominent and maybe not so prominent events and places. So in order to highlight some familiar and unfamiliar sites. Now, we started with the Roman occupation that created London within that 1 square mile that we see here. And then in the Middle Ages, the city of London established its own government with a Lord Mayor and aldermen. In Tudor times, we saw the rise of theaters in London. The Stuart period saw the destruction of 4/5 of the city of London and the birth of a new St. Paul's Cathedral. The Georgians launched new street designs and beautiful parks, and the Victorians gave us some of the most iconic sites in London today, including Tower Bridge, the Elizabeth Tower, and the Royal Albert Hall. So some things never change. We end up where we started. Within that 1 square mile, the city of London, the city within a city that the Romans founded. Today, the landscape is both familiar and very different. So there are medieval streets that sort of snuggle right up to these glass skyscrapers. But the city of London still remains a vibrant and vital part of London. There's still a Lord Mayor. There's still a Lord Mayor's Day parade. There are still livery companies dating back to the medieval times. London is obviously much larger than that original square mile, but it's just as international as it was back in Roman days. And the great foundations from the Roman walls, the medieval churches, the half-timbered Tudor buildings, Victorian gardens, they still stand. Not many of the Tudor stuff, admittedly, but you can still see these vestiges of London's history. And the bomb scars of World War II still remain. And London displays pageantry much as the same way it did in Tudor times, with these coronation spectacles and wedding processions. It has survived plagues and fires and riots and bombs, and it still stands. It's still constantly evolving. This is why I love it so much. And I hope I've given you some more insight into this great city. And again, it is constantly evolving. As I said, this photograph was from a few years ago. And again, you can see the gherkin, you can see the walkie-talkie. This is from more recently. And the gherkin is totally hidden. Everything, and in fact, this is how grown up has become. If I take I blow this up again, can I even find it? Found it. Yeah, here is the Tower of London down here. There's the White Tower that we talked about with William the Conqueror, and as you can see, it is absolutely dwarfed by all these new buildings. But I hope you enjoyed these sessions. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now. And I will turn on my video. And I see that there are comments in here. Peter said from the ages of 4 to 5, he slept in a Morrison shelter during the raids. Was there someone sleeping in those shelters with you? Did the whole family cram in, or?
Can't recall really. I was too young, but we had that in our kitchen. We had a very big kitchen, a house built in 1780, huge area. No, I'm getting my houses mixed up. That house was built in 1910. And that was sat in the kitchen, and it became our dining room table.
Oh, hey, perfect. Double usage.
But I can't remember. It would only be when this was 1944 now,
Okay.
44 to 45. So it would only be when we received a warning, which by that time you got these those kids, we all got, really scared, the air raids go.
I think I would have had a nervous breakdown if I was living in London
And when
during
you
that time.
heard,
Oh, they did
when
it.
you heard without the oscillation, the air raid was over.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, okay. So that told you when it ended. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the closest it got to that house, when I went to school, I used to walk past a bomb crater
Mhm.
Probably 300 yards. That's the
Mhm.
closest it got to us. But what was interesting, you did mention the V1 and the V2. The British had the first jet aircraft at the end of the war. In school, I was an Air Force cadet, so
Ah,
that's where this
okay.
comes from. In high school, and these aircraft could go faster than these V1s.
Well, they
The
could knock.
V1s had wings and they flew horizontally, and the pilots learned that they could come up to them, get their wing underneath, and flip
Ah.
them,
Oh,
and
wow.
then they would crash.
Mhm. Nice.
You couldn't do that with the V2, but I
Yeah, the
don't.
V2s were pretty untouchable. They
Hey,
were hard
V2s
to,
went up and down,
yeah,
Von Braun and all that.
yeah.
Um,
I worked with someone, I actually had a boss, I had a supervisor, my very first job. My supervisor was British, was from London, and she came over to the United States to be a nanny. And ended up, after she was a nanny, she got a job elsewhere. And she was my supervisor, and she lived in the East End of London, and she always told this story about how, and they were getting bombs dropped around them all the time. And she told this story of at the top of their stairs, going up the stairs of their house, was their toilet. It was a little toilet room. And she said one night her father was in the toilet, on the toilet, and a bomb dropped nearby and it blasted the door off the toilet door. And her father was sitting there on the toilet and said, damn, these Germans, a man can't even take a, I won't say the word, in his own house. But she said, and we thought
and
that was so funny as kids. We were laughing about it as kids, but she said he was just like,
yeah, in 1941, during the air raids, I was a baby, and I am told, because I don't have memory of this, that when the air raids sounded, well, actually, often my father was out. He was an air raid warden.
a warden. Mhm.
Yeah, essentially sort of civilian touring the neighborhood. That if he was home, they would put their gas masks on. I don't think gas was ever used, but they were forever afraid of it.
Yeah, it
They
wasn't booze, but they had those. Yeah.
and
You
they
had a
put
box,
me
right?
and they put me in a baby's one with
Oh,
total. And my parents were under the stairs because that was the strongest place, a cupboard under the stairs, and my parents had to keep pumping the air through this
wow.
container with a filter on it
Wow.
because that was the only way that could be done for babies. So I survived.
Again, I marvel at I really honestly think if I had to go through 59 straight nights of bombing or the fear of bombing, I think I would have had a nervous breakdown. I don't know how people got through that. I mean, it
And
must have been
when I
so
was a
grueling.
little bit older, enough to understand, but we're still talking before four. There were still bombing raids, but my parents invented fairy stories around them. So I thought these were the Mr. Gnome's whistles. These were the sirens, and Mr. Gnome
Oh,
guns as the anti-aircraft guns
yeah.
going off. I was totally ignorant until I moved at the age of 4 to another town, and boy next door fled in fear when he heard the siren. And that was the first time I realized it was dangerous.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anyhow, I've spoken enough because I could give you some more. But
Yeah,
the,
no,
other,
the
the others
stories
need a
are
word in
fascinating.
edgeways.
Yeah, and I see you were at you were at Buckingham Palace. So yeah, because at the end
I
of World
do
War II, they all
remember,
came out with Churchill. Churchill was out there with,
I remember as I would have been 5, I think, walked, taken to the palace, and we were way outside the gates, but the balcony was illuminated and the king and queen
yeah,
appeared.
yeah. And
That
I
was
think
the
Churchill
end.
came out with them too at one point. He
Yeah, well,
appeared.
I
Yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
remember that.
yeah. Um,
Sorry.
oh no, that's okay. Um, other comments or
Yeah,
questions?
my mother tells a story in when her house was bombed. She lived in the suburbs, and there was one. Apparently, a German bomber had one extra bomb, and they let it go, and it hit my mother's house. They were they were saved by sitting under the grand piano. But
Wow.
apparently, all their friends and neighbors came. They said that they looked completely white. They were completely covered in white dust. And one of my grandfather's first worries was that they had lost their ration books.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they
Well,
didn't know where they were going to
practicality.
get food the next
Yeah, they
day.
weren't sure. They weren't
They'd lost their house, but she was worried
Yeah.
about the ration books.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also remember the Great Smog.
Mm.
It was incredible, and it was very widespread. It was not just in central London; it was in the suburbs as well.
Mm.
That was quite something. I noticed, by the way, that you didn't really talk too much about the era between the wars,
Right.
uh, and the Great Strike, the General
Right.
Strike, and all
The
that.
general strike. Yeah, there was a lot. There was so much more to cover. But yes, the general strike, of course, that was another huge, huge event that affected the whole country. But yeah, London and people taking up the duties and things during the strike. Yeah, that was what, 1927? 20, yeah,
26, yeah.
26, 26, 26. Yeah. Yeah, it's as I said, so much more I could have covered. And I was even thinking about that with the 70s because I was thinking about, 76 with the whole um oh God, I'm blanking on the prime minister's name at the time, but during the whole miners' strike and when they were turning off the lights and they had 3-day work weeks, and again, that was across the country, but it also affected London. But it just, yeah, there just wasn't time to cover everything that was going on at that time. Maybe another session someday. Maybe.
But I
Yeah.
mean, I think the feeling was that London was never really recovered after the Second World War until about 1960. It was a black and white place.
Mhm.
You could still see bomb sites, but then things sort of changed in the early and mid 60s, and suddenly became swinging London.
Yep, yep, yep. Yeah, the swinging
Yeah.
60s. I didn't talk about King's Road and the whole that whole bit either. There was another
Yeah.
whole interesting part of London.
Oh, Lorraine.
I just wanted to, one thing before I go, I just wanted to apologize because my I was having problems with Spectrum. It was going in and out.
Uh-huh.
And so my mute was going in and out
Oh, that's
also.
okay. That's okay. That's okay.
And that's why I was unmuted there for a
No,
while.
no, no,
So I
no, no problem.
apologize.
It was only for a second. That's okay.
Yeah,
No-
one a bit on sociology. I mean, when I was child and teenager, London was almost totally white and full of English.
Mhm.
There were some exceptions, actually. We had, for a couple of years, we had a woman living with us who was from Sierra Leone. And she went back to become the Minister of Education in Sierra Leone. And she had a boyfriend who was a man from the city who came on Sunday afternoons for tea. This boyfriend was also a black guy from Sierra Leone. He was always in a suit, a pocket handkerchief,
Oh,
and we loved him because he could do magic tricks. So
oh.
he would keep us entertained. But apart from that, you go back to London now. It is so changed over the last 60 years that it's rare to see somebody who looks as if they might be native British
Mm.
when you're in the London Underground.
It's a very, again, very, very, well, it's like New York. I mean, it's very, very multicultural and lots of
Oh,
languages.
wow.
I mean, you hear people on the street just speaking
Yeah.
every
But
language.
I went to a school which I told you about earlier, which was founded in 1558. It had the name of a grammar school. When I was there, it was 100% English. We started the day with a short Christian service every day. It was a state school, but anybody could opt out if they wished to do so.
Oh,
I-
really? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, if you were Jewish and you didn't want to do it, you could opt
Oh,
out. I don't know anybody who opted out.
you opted out. Yeah. Yeah.
But now I look at the pictures of this same school. The school uniform is the same. This is at the northern edge of the Greater London now. The school uniform is the same, but it is 75% black.
Hmm.
It is now what they call a comprehensive school. It's no longer
Right.
a selective school.
Right.
But the pictures of the students are just so different. I presume this is again because immigrants have moved into this area, and the people who lived there previously have moved further out, or they're working
moved further out.
remotely or whatever.
Yeah,
But also with fast trains, you don't have to live close to, let's say you work in the city. You can travel from Bristol in an hour.
Oh,
and a half.
absolutely. I mean, that's part of the thing with the population that was dropping, you know, that it's much
Yeah.
cheaper to live outside, and you can either commute in, or again, since a
Also,
lot of people aren't working in the city.
when I was a child, it took on public transport over an hour to get from the northern suburbs to the center. In 1990, on the motorway equivalent to an interstate ring road,
Ring Road,
you
the
could
Ring
get
Road.
from where it crossed the Thames to the northern extremity of the Greater London area in 10 minutes.
Wow, wow, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the kind of, the opting out of the prayer thing makes me think about the change too. I think there was a time period when people were, my father was from Syria, so the feeling then was you assimilate, assimilate, assimilate immediately. So he could speak Arabic because they spoke it at home, but he could barely remember it because it was all about assimilation. And I think people did not want to stand out. They did not want to be seen as different, you know, and now there's, I think, more ethnic pride and more sense of, you know, embracing your own identity, your heritage or your ethnic heritage or something that there probably wasn't at that time. So I'm guessing some people just did not want to stand out as being the ones that didn't take part when all of their classmates were, you know.
That's probably,
staying
well,
for certain-
if I look at their surnames, I thought they were all English. But when you
Yeah.
have a name like Klein, Klein,
Yeah, yeah,
that's obviously German.
yeah.
And Domino, he was obviously probably of Italian extraction.
Mhm.
But it when it wasn't a multi-ethnic universe, it never occurred to you that these people
Right.
had slightly different background.
Right, right, right. Other comments or questions? Thoughts?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
When are you leading a tour?
Oh, gosh. You're putting the pressure on me now.
Oh yeah. I'm going to sign up. My wife says
Okay.
she'll come too.
Oh, wow. Okay. I am thinking about it. I don't know. I'll have to see, but yeah,
I mean,
it's
this would be incredible to go round. Even though I grew up in London, 90% of the places you visited mentioned, I didn't know they
Yeah.
existed.
Yeah. And I'm sure plenty more that I'm still bumping into. I mean, that's another thing I love about it. There's always something to discover. There's always new little niches.
So I don't know who BWT2 is, but you gonna come?
Yeah,
You're just pushing for a
certainly I
tour.
would come. I had the same experience of you. I think it was something like 600 or 700 in our school. One person opted out of the morning congregation, just one.
Mhm.
And everyone thought he was lucky because he could get to school 15 minutes later than everybody else.
He didn't have to be there.
Exactly.
Everybody else will get a prefix detention.
Or
Late.
or he could sit in that room and get 15 minutes of homework done.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. I had the opposite early education experience in the sense that I went to a school where in a university town, well, here in Ithaca, and at the time there was a school called East Hill School, and it was mostly children of graduate students because back then people married younger, they had families already. And there were a lot of Japanese, there were a lot of Indian. I remember going to one of my classmates' homes and his mother was in a sari and they sat on the floor. And I thought that was just the greatest thing ever. It's what really got me interested in other cultures. And I vividly remember we had a new student in school who was from South Africa. And the teacher said, we've got this student coming in from South Africa. And I had seen other African students in our school. And this girl came in and she was white. And I'd never realized that there were white people in Africa, you know, the whole thing with South Africa. But for me, it was fascinating because there weren't that many just garden variety, you know, white kids, Caucasian kids. There are a lot of international kids, and I absolutely, that's what got me so fascinated by different cultures and wanting to travel and things. I thought it was fascinating.
If
But
if you read the books about Billy Bunton, I think he went to school at Greyfriars.
yes,
Do you know?
yeah,
You remember that? Of
yep,
course,
yep,
there was one token, and he was a Indian prince. I think he was a
right,
Nawab Pataudi,
right.
and and that was my 5 6 year old
Vision of India.
view of what a a foreign student was like. He would be an Indian prince and probably good at cricket.
Right, right, right.
Well, what
Right.
you spoke about the Windrush, and this is probably a little later, but maybe over a period of 10 years, all the small grocery stores got taken over by Pakistanis.
Mhm,
Why? Because
mhm.
the English worked from 9 to 5 and then shut the store. The
Mhm.
Pakistanis kept the store open till 10 at night.
Yep.
And therefore, people went and bought stuff when they got home from work, and Pakistanis did better than the English owned stores.
Yeah. Well,
But
it was like here too. I mean, you'd have the Greeks running grocery stores and you'd have the Italians running, these little shops, these corner shops and stuff. And again, they would put in all the hours of the day. They were working almost 24/7.
And
but
when
you still had the blue laws, which meant that
Yes.
these Pakistanis could not open
On
their
Sundays and
on
different, yeah.
Sundays.
Yeah.
Only the Jewish
Yep.
um, market could open on the Sunday. Otherwise, it was
I would
evening.
imagine a lot of Pakistanis suddenly declared they were Jewish.
Well, it was only in certain areas. I forget what's the where the Sunday market was, the famous Sunday market. Uh, I forget, in London. Yeah.
That wasn't, no, Billingsgate was the fish market. That was during the week.
It must have been somewhere in the East End.
Spitalfields, I don't think
No,
Spitalfield open
no.
Brick
on-
Lane,
I think it was mainly for Sundays.
Okay, okay, yeah, I'll have
Brick
to,
Lane, Brick Lane,
what?
Brick Lane.
No, no, that's
No,
not.
Brick Lane is, yeah, that's, the market there was near the Spitalfield, that was near Spitalfields, the old Spitalfields market. Brick Lane is a fascinating place to walk around, but they don't have a market. And well, then there were like the Petticoat Lane and all those other street markets that they had. But yeah, I don't know which one was the Sunday one. That wasn't Petticoat, was it? I don't remember. I don't know. I'll have to look it up. Yeah, that one I don't remember. But well, Peter, I'll let you know. I've had like 4 people ask about a tour now, so I'll have to see. I'll have to see what I can do. And what we should cover, because there's a lot to see and do, but you have to put on your walking shoes because boy, I walk everywhere and that's the best way to stumble on these. That's how I found the Postman's Park, was just stumbled across it. I'm like, what is this? And so yeah, that's to me the best way to see London. Any other comments or questions? Well, thank you so much for indulging me over the last 8 weeks. I really appreciated your attendance and your input, and I hope you enjoyed it. And next week I get to take a break, and Peter's going to entertain us. So that'll be nice. I can sit on the other side of the screen.
No, we expect you to make a lot of comments.
No, it's all yours. It's all your show.
Yes, I'm going to do the history of London Bridge,
The London history
but
of London
only because I did that for the City Club.
Mhm.
I put it together during COVID.
I'm
And so
looking forward
all
to it. It
this entire thing. So I said, might as well use it.
Yeah, no, your slides look terrific. So I'm looking forward to that. And then a couple of weeks after that, I believe I'll have to look at the exact date, 16th, 15th. I will do the London Parks and Gardens series. And as I said, I've got 3 other series, one on museums and monuments, one on historic houses and palaces, and one on, what's the third? I'm blanking out what the third one is, but churches, of course, churches. So I've got all of those that I can offer in the future as well, where we can dive a little more deeply into some of these places that we only skimmed over briefly in this series. But have a great afternoon. Enjoy the sunshine out there. It's a rare occurrence, but we've had it about 3 days in a row. So enjoy and see everybody soon. Take care.
So Thanks very much. Great
You're
series.
welcome.
All
Thank
good.
you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.